Okay, wonderful. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is day 4 and it's getting more and more exciting. I think everything is coming into focus now. And today I'm really excited to talk to Jasmine Afshar. Uh, they say, Henry David Thoreau said that for 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, there is one hacking at the roots. And Jasmine has been working on animal liberation. Is a passionate uh, advocate for the animals, and the animals, God knows, need such advocates right now. And I've been struck by how she frames the discussions around animal liberation and how she cajoles and persuades vegans to go beyond just living vegan. And I've been really inspired by her work. Because I use the analogy of the house on fire. So if our house is on fire, the first thing we need to do is to stop pouring fuel on the fire. And that is veganism. Veganism is about not pouring fuel on the fire. And then you have to convince others who are pouring fuel on the fire to stop pouring fuel on the fire. And then you have to put out the fire. So that's another story. You have to put out the fire, and then you have to start rebuilding the house. So there's a lot of work that needs to go beyond just going vegan. And I've been watching Jasmine and her colleagues work on this. And it's a pleasure to have you on this show. And thank you so much for coming to the summit and talking to us about what you're doing. So I'm going to just leave the floor to you now, and tell us a little bit more about what exactly you do beyond, what exactly you do with the community, persuading them to go beyond veganism.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to thank you for allowing me to have this platform to speak on this. And I, of course, follow all of your great work that you do as well. I think this house on fire scenario is probably the best scenario, the more I thought about it. Because I think it really takes into account all of the things we need to improve on within this movement. So like you said, when there's a fire on a house, we need people to stop pouring fuel on that. Well, within that, there's also actions that you can take that are better and actions that you can take are worse or more effective and less effective. And so, you're walking down the street, you see this house on fire. A vegan would simply walk past that. Now, someone who feels compelled to act, there's many different levels that you can feel compelled to act on. So I bring this up because I think that in the vegan or the animal rights movement right now, the animal liberation movement even, I see this tendency to view action for the sake of action as the ideal. Now, action for the sake of action is very important. It's much better to take an action than not take an action. Mm-hmm. However, when we go back to that house scenario, we look at the different actions that you can take. Now, one person may spit on the flames, and they said, well, I helped, I didn't pour fuel on, I added some water to that. Another person may think, well, I don't have water on me, so I'm gonna, maybe urinate on the fire or something. And then you have the activist who's like, well, I don't see anything within my abilities that can immediately turn or put this flame out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to seek external means of trying to help that. I'm going to go maybe call in some fire helicopters, get the fire department here. And then I'm also going to help with pouring buckets on the fire. And so what I see in the vegan movement is this, or the animal liberation movement, is this tendency to, once they break past that point of realizing there's a necessity to act, just act for the sake of acting. And of course, again, that's better than not acting, but why do something that's less harmful when we could actually be impactful? And so right now, what we're doing in this movement is we're trying to take a step back and really strategically analyze our steps and see if we're moving in a way that's most effective for the animals. Alex Mills actually created a great post about this, where he highlighted some of the different forms of advocacy and the trouble or the mistakes that we're making along the way and thinking that they're going to be impactful. So one thing that we tend to do as advocates is we look to past social justice movements to analyze whether our actions right now are effective. However, what we're failing to do as we're going along this process is analyzing if the circumstances that made that action effective are the same circumstances that exist today. And my favorite one that he pointed out was advertising. So protests were a lot more effective when we didn't have mass advertising and billboards all over the place and commercials. And really all you could see in order to stay in touch with what's going on in the world around you were posters. And so now that we're in this age of mass advertising, protests in themselves are not as effective as they once were. However, we cling to this idea of hanging on to protests because one, it's an action for the sake of acting, and that's better than not doing anything for the animals. And two, we saw it effective at some point in history. So what we're really calling for at this point in time is a reanalysis of our actions. You know, yes, we need to go from vegan to active, and we need to be strategic activists. So to your point about how do we go about pulling those people, I think it's really about making this a personal matter to individuals. So in other plights around the world, we are directly the victims of the harm that's being done.
Right.
In this movement, we are not the victims. So it's a lot easier to place our comfort over what the victims need. And I think that we need to understand that we can take action at all different levels. However, it's always going to require some sacrifice on our part. And we need to start viewing animals the same way that we view our loved ones, and saying that, you know, if it was our loved one trapped in these cages, if it was our loved one in the burning house, you know, what would we be doing to take action? Again, I'm sorry, I kind of went off on a little bit of a tangent there and I touched on a lot of different points. So I'm hoping we can bring it back together. I'm trying not to, there's a lot I have to say on this. And so I'm trying not to just blabber on, and I feel like I'm doing that right now. So I'm going to take a step back and I'm going to like, see if we can have some dialogue back and forth.
No, it's been great. Thank you. You know, I mean, you're right that the circumstances are different. The tools are different. And so there are different tools available to us that our ancestors did not have, you know, during their protests.
Exactly.
So, yeah. Things like Anonymous for the Voiceless, where, you know, people are standing in street corners showing what is happening to the animals.
Right.
Now, that kind of activism was not possible for Gandhi, for instance, or Martin Luther King, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think bringing those creative pools into that advocacy is what we really need in this movement right now. We need to stop looking to, okay, what has already been done, and start analyzing what can we do to be effective.
Right. Yeah. What can we do? Basically, it looks like, you know, we are looking at either informing people about what is going on. So there is a whole group of people who don't know, or who are pretending not to know. Some of them are pretending not to know what is going on, and having them confront their own demons, right? Which is
Exactly.
what the AV is trying to do. But it's what is the most effective way to reach the people who are on the fence?
You know, I actually found it's kind of the same all across the board. So whether someone is vegan, even an activist, and you're trying to like maybe unwind some of that speciesism, or it's a non-vegan that you're just trying to pull into veganism, or non-vegan straight to advocate, I've found the answer is always personal accountability. You know, getting people to acknowledge their role that they played directly in the injustices that they don't want to see persist. So when, for instance, I'm a minority, and when I realized that I had become the oppressor that once oppressed my ancestors, you know, that was something very hard for me to cope with. And that personal accountability of recognizing that and acknowledging that I was doing those same behaviors to another vulnerable being who looks different, speaks different, and has different cultural traditions than I, that's what made me compelled to act so fast, so quickly, was that accountability, the personal accountability, the role I played directly in that action. And so, I think vegans and advocates have this fear at times of being perceived as less than ideal. And that really inhibits our advocacy. What we're doing is not about a popularity contest. If we look to any past social justice movement, the advocates were almost never seen favorably. And the reason for that is because change happens in discomfort. So we're the ones causing discomfort. So of course, people are not going to be that favorable of us until they realize the change that's necessary to be made. And then at that point, they look back and they're grateful for the actions that advocates have taken. However, we must come to this place where we're not afraid of looking bad. And the reason for that is because pushing personal accountability is never something that others perceive favorably. It's a very challenging process to come to terms in oneself that we're acting outside of our own values. And so therefore, it is going to be a little bit more of a tense conversation. They're probably not going to see you very ideally, for the immediate time period. However, those points of confrontation are what stick in people's long-term memory. And the reason for that is because the amygdala, the place that stores a lot of our long-term memory, it's triggered by emotions. So if we have a little bit of an emotional trigger, we're now putting that conversation in that person's long-term memory. So having a little bit of intensity there is not a bad thing. It's okay to be direct and forward and, push personal accountability. I notice in some organizations, they kind of steer away from the notion of saying, you are doing X, Y, and Z. And the reason for that is because they're trying to protect that entity. They need that entity to be seen favorably by the public so they can continue receiving donations, so that they can maybe bring in their spectrum of support. However, by doing so, we're almost muting our message, and we're not enforcing that personal accountability that really leads to change.
Right. So the way I found most effective getting people to think about their personal accountability is to actually tell my story and tell my story and how I felt shame when I realized that I was doing something wrong. I felt guilt. So I felt those things that they may be feeling, at that time. So then it becomes like it becomes like a joint journey as opposed to, me coming from a place of superiority, telling them what to do, right?
Definitely so agree.
I remember, I was giving a talk in Canada, and someone told me, it's difficult to make this change when you're making people feel guilty, right? And I told her, actually, please welcome that guilt.
Yeah.
That is the source of your change.
Yes, absolutely. And it's funny because a lot of people talk about shame as if it's something that can be imposed on someone else. However, shame is an emotion that's entirely internally driven. So it's not us shaming anyone. It's us bringing facts that create shame that needs to be embraced, just like you said.
Right.
And one thing that I've acknowledged is a real hurdle in trying to get more folks to be active and kind of embrace the discomfort that comes with advocacy is a lack of societal, it's like almost a societal wide epidemic where folks don't feel empowered to do much. I've talked with a lot of people about veganism, and, the folks who are non-vegan, they're willing to embrace veganism, but they also say, well, it doesn't feel like I'm doing anything though. What can I do to change this? I show them the facts. I tell them how awful the breadth and depth of this genocide is. And surprisingly, a lot of folks do want to help. They just feel powerless. And, I talk with them and I'm like, well, what would you do if you wanted to do more? And a lot of people think that the most they can do is go out on the streets and hold a sign. So I think we really need to focus on acknowledging that change exists within each one of us, and that we all have the capability to accomplish amazing feats. So here's my problem. Here lies my problem with like celebrity worship and idolization of different advocates. Because what happens is it creates a distinction that doesn't even exist.
Right.
So, you know, some folks will compare themselves to me and they'll be like, well, I can't do the things that you do. And I was like, wrong, you can do the things that I can do and more, you know? And so it's through hero worshiping and idolization, I feel like to an extent, we've almost like disempowered ourselves, you know, back to that burning house
Right.
idea. I see a lot of folks who want to help, who are just standing by the burning house, waiting for a celebrity or someone that they idolize to come in and create the change that needs to happen. You know, not until Beyonce says we need to be active is it going to be acceptable to be active. And, you know, or we look at Greta. Greta is another great example. You know, Greta, there's no difference between Greta and every other individual who's on this live stream, who is on Facebook and walking the earth today. She is a young child who acknowledged that she has a responsibility to create change. And I think what we have a tendency to do is we see folks like Greta, we idolize them, and then we place them on this pedestal that tells us that we can never accomplish those same feats. However, we have to have everyone realize that Greta is not special. You know, I am not special. You know, I am just an average individual. Greta is just an average individual who acknowledged that we have an absolute necessity to change the course of this planet, and it has to happen immediately.
Right, right. Yeah, completely resonate with you. You know, in fact, I think Shelley Ostroff had said that there is this victim, perpetrator, savior triangle that we sit in.
Yes, absolutely. That's absolutely the best way to say that it really is the cyclical existence that we have.
Right. Yeah. And the system deliberately tries to disempower every one of us because they don't want us to start, making trouble. They want us to just conform, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so that's exactly the point. It's like when I ask people, like, why do you think the most that you can do is protest? Like, why do you think the most you can do is go stand on the side of the street? And like, that's it. And a lot of people are like, because that's what I was told. You know, the system has deliberately, created this like infectious notion in school that the most you can do is, either very peacefully march or hold a sign on the side of the street. And when I ask people, have you considered strategic disobedience as an effective means of creating change? It's like I just open an entirely new world to them. And so I think we really have to start talking more about the acts of strategic disobedience that are going to get us to the places that we need to be. And in order to do so, I really believe we need to kind of break down this whole like nonviolent rhetoric for folks, because what I've not acknowledged is in some circles, nonviolence is being treated in a way that it wasn't intentionally created to be. So violence is the act or it's an action or behavior taken with the intent to harm, destroy, or damage another being. Now, we can acknowledge it is violent to take a knife to an animal's throat who has done nothing wrong. However, it is not a violent act to stop violent acts from happening. And so I've noticed within the animal rights movement, there's almost a segregation of folks who take more intensive direct action because it's labeled as violent when it's actually not. So one great example I can think of is the badger cull defense that's happening overseas right now. So right now it's the badger hunt season. So their hunters are going out laying traps all over the place, and they're seeking to catch badgers and kill them. Well, the advocates are going out and actively staying up all night and destroying the traps, taking the hunter equipment, like the cameras that they have, so that they can use it to monitor different locations to see if there's hunters in the area. So they're destroying the traps, they're taking the equipment. And in our circles within the animal rights movement, because of this false labeling of nonviolent, these advocates aren't getting support because people are perceiving smashing cages as a violent act. However, the violent act is placing the cage out to capture a free individual and take them back to kill them. It is not a violent act to then stop that act from happening. And so that's another huge problem that I see, is like the way the system has tried to relabel violence and the nonviolent movement is that, you know, you can't be confrontational, that's violent. You know, you can't be forward, that's violent. I was actually told during an action by an organization that, you know, directly confronting someone about mocking or even directly harming an animal was a violent act. And I really think that we need to either like abolish this notion within our circles or reclaim its true definition, which is what was stated earlier, is that, you know, nonviolent acts are acts that are in defense of others, in defense of vulnerable beings. And you really can't have a violent action that's taken to dismantle violence unless it is like directly, I think, killing someone. And that point I could say, yeah, at that point it's a violent act, and I would not support that. However, you know, I think the notion of like smashing cages or, you know, even breaking in doors to go in and rescue a vulnerable individual who's trapped and who is in absolute torment, those are not violent. And by doing so, we disempower folks from taking those more strategic disobediences. And I think that that is a real harm to our movement, because the ALF did some amazing work and nearly destroyed the vivisection industry. But yet in our current circles, they would be labeled as violent and extremely disempowered from taking those actions.
Right. The way Gandhi was framing it, he would say that if you put your body on the line to prevent that violence from happening, you know, that he said was the epitome of nonviolent disobedience. You know?
Agreed. Yeah, Gandhi had it right. I think what's happening is people just hear the word and they're attaching their own definitions to it. And we need to reclaim Gandhi's perspective of it, in the sense that, you know, like you said, acts of service, using our bodies in acts of service for others is a nonviolent action. And, you know, I think one reason for this disempowerment is that even in our vegan circles, we're having people really disempower folks for taking more direct, bold actions. And I think that, you know, we really have to place a greater emphasis on strategic disobedience. And if we can't take that strategic disobedience, supporting those who are taking it to the best of our abilities.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But there is so much that needs to be done, you know, because this movement is just growing right now. It's growing exponentially, but there are so many people who have to be informed, who have to come on board. So it's just like the beginning of what Gandhi was doing in the 1920s.
Yeah.
So we are in the beginning stages of it. So this is why people can get involved, and at the same time, they can get involved to their comfort level. There is it takes a lot of courage to do what Gandhi did. It takes a lot of courage to do strategic disobedience. Yeah.
Definitely. And the great thing is even within actions that are under the guise of, or under the label of strategic disobedience, there's often so many different dimensions that can be taken that don't directly involve an active disobedience. So one thing that I think of is jail support, or, you know, sometimes we need people to talk to reporters. Sometimes we need people just there to act as support who don't actually have to take part in the disobedience, but are there to show support in numbers. So even within strategic disobedience, there's so many dimensions that advocates can take roles within that will suit their comfort level. And yeah, I think that, you know, within this, more support for confrontational direct action has to inherently come more questioning of the police, the prison systems, and the government. And so that's another problem that I see that's really deeply embedded within our movement. And I'll try to break it down by giving an example, because I think that may be the best way to highlight it. But oftentimes when we go to do actions, what we say about the farmers are, you know, they're just good people just doing their jobs. When the police come, we say, you know, we understand they're just good people, they're doing their jobs. However, then when we do an act that directly counters what the police and the farmers say, we now look like the bad people, because we're openly saying, you know, they're just doing their jobs, they're good people. Okay, well, if they're good people and they're just doing their jobs, why are you breaking into their farm and trying to rescue animals? So we're almost painting our own movement in a negative light. And so within that, what I would ask people to consider is redefining or rethinking how they want to paint the police and the exploiters within our industry. Now, that's not to say you have to make like outright lies about them or make them feel or push them to like depression or anything like that. However, I think putting some accountability is very important, and painting our enemies for who they are, you know, actually identifying our enemies and why they are our enemies, so that we can strategically take action against them. So the police, we'll start with the government, actually. The government's role is to maintain their assets of their nation. That is their first priority, and will always be their first priority, is to maintain their assets. Now, the role of the police is to protect those assets. So, and the prison system, of course, is in order to get free labor from those who oppose both the government and the police system. So when we are trying to be active, what we need to realize is that we are directly targeting their assets. So we're not going to work on the same plateau, because their ultimate goal is to disempower us, and our ultimate goal is to overwhelm them. So we can find maybe areas where we can resonate with each other. For instance, there are politicians who believe in certain rights for animals, and so there may be strategic times to align ourselves with them. However, I don't think that there should ever come a time where we perceive them as our direct allies, as these are the folks who, if we look throughout history, have been the direct oppressors time and time and time again. You know, we look to the civil rights movement. The police and the government were not on their side. They sought to destroy them at every turn possible. They've actually created branches within the FBI and local police departments with the sole intent of disempowering and dismantling new advocacy groups from arising. So, you know, an example I can think of is there's many advocates who think that the right answer is to call the police, to have the police present at an action. However, I cannot, you know, discourage people from doing that enough. I've seen it happen multiple times where folks call the police thinking that they're going to be protected by them. And what the police do is they lie, and they actually push them into the most or the least productive areas that they could possibly be. So one example is I was with an AV group one time, and they had set up in this really great spot on 4th of July. However, because the police came, they actually pushed them in an entirely different direction under the guise that it was against the law to set up there. And it wasn't at all. They had lied and said like someone rented out a sidewalk or something like that, which is an outright lie that we can all acknowledge as a lie. But they are allowed to lie. We can't lie to them, but they are more than allowed to lie to us to disempower and dismantle our movements. So we must, like, immediately, our first step must be, you know, no longer aligning ourselves with the police, prison systems, or government as allies, considering they are like our number one enemies right now. It is the government who is giving subsidies to farms when we are showing them that our demand does not want that. So we have to work and acknowledge that the police and the government are not our allies. We can use them to accomplish our strategic goals, but we must always keep in mind that their goal is the complete opposite of ours.
Right. they're playing roles in the current system, right? They're
Yeah.
playing roles in the current system that
Yes.
is about protecting the assets. Basically, it all begins with um, exploiting animals, right? So
Yeah.
you start putting fences to prevent the animals from going away. So that
Yeah.
becomes now your property.
Yes,
So then,
exactly.
it all starts with having, when we start farming animals, we start saying this is private property. And then
Yep.
we use governments to protect our private property. So when you
Yeah,
say we have to free the animals, you're really going against everything that's in the current system.
exactly. Yeah, so we can't actually hold on one second. My computer just gave me the notification it may die. So I'm gonna go grab my charger really quickly. Sorry about
Sure,
that.
sure. So it brings to mind actually the
All right. Sorry about that.
no problem. Yesterday when we were talking to Shelley, Shelley's Codes for a Healthy Earth
Yeah.
says that the only legitimate purpose of governance is to protect and cultivate the health and vitality of the planet and all its inhabitants for generations to come.
Exactly.
It's not about protecting the property of individuals.
Exactly.
So it's about reframing our role, the role of governance, and reframing how we have to organize ourselves. Because
Yeah.
I tell the story that we are done with the current phase of human existence, where
Yes.
we prevented the Earth from going back to another ice age, and now we have to become the caretaker species
I
for
agree.
all life. And it's time for us to do that now, because there is only 10% of the wildlife is left in terms of biomass from what they used to be.
Yeah, it's absolutely egregious what we have done to this planet. And that's why I advocate, like, it doesn't matter what level you're on right now, all of us, vegan, activist, non-vegan, we all have to change the way we interact with each other, with
Right.
with the world around us, and with its inhabitants. And that's why veganism to me is like, veganism is a baby step. So that's why it's very hard for me sometimes when people advocate baby steps, because veganism is a baby step towards a better world.
Right.
Even when we remove the use of animals, there's still speciesism we have to address. And that is a notion of human supremacy that leads to the exploitation of animals. And so there are even some vegans and advocates who embody speciesism. I still embody speciesism because it was so tightly wound into me that to this day, I'm still pulling, unwinding the knot that was created in me to be speciesist from the time I was born. There's homophobia, sexism, racism, all of these things that we still need to address. So we don't have time to baby step. Veganism is the baby step towards the better world. It is the action that's going to halt adding to the fire. And then it's going to be time to start putting the flames out.
Right.
And so when we take a baby step, all we're saying, when we baby step the baby step of veganism, what we're saying is like, maybe just throw half a gallon of fuel on the flame instead of the whole gallon, and we don't need that. That's not what's helping us. What we need is for people to acknowledge, again, on all levels, that we must fundamentally change the way we interact with everything around us. And it's very hard. I will admit that, there's some things are so ingrained into us that so a lot of times we don't even acknowledge we're embodying it. And so another thing is we have to be more willing to listen to our comrades, because we don't always know when we're embodying this privilege or when we're exuding some sort of ism. And we have to be able to hear out our friends who are giving us feedback and saying, hey, right now you're acting slightly speciesist. And like, I'm not telling you this to call you out. I'm telling you this so that we can improve our interactions with the world, the animals, and each other. And so, yeah, I think another change that needs to happen is a greater acceptance of feedback. And I think just community dynamics in general. So having been involved in organizing for about 3 years, one thing that I've noticed is that community dynamics are probably the hardest part of advocacy. And the reason for that is because you have so many different personalities from all walks of life, and again, we're not the ones being oppressed to share in that like camaraderie of like, oh, well, we're all being oppressed in the same ways. And so it can make interpersonal relationships within communities slightly challenging. And I think what I've learned throughout time is one of the biggest reasons why it can be so challenging is there's not a willingness to accept feedback. So no matter how harsh feedback may come, there's typically always some information that you can take out of it. I was watching this really great TED Talk about how it's not the giver's duty to give in the most tactful way. It's actually the receiver who holds all the power in a conversation. So, if you were to look at me and say something very, direct and blunt and maybe not seem the most compassionate, I can guarantee that there's still maybe one sentence within that is factual that I can learn to grow from, and I can discard the rest. And that is what's going to make us phenomenal advocates, because right now we have too much of a tendency to clap for each other when we actually don't even believe in what we're clapping for.
Right.
And we're doing that because we want to keep people empowered. We want to keep people feeling like what they're doing is benefiting the world around them. And to some extent it is. However, we also need to be ready and willing to both give and accept feedback so that we can actually become like great advocates.
Yeah, great point. Thank you, Jasmine.
Yeah.
I also on the analogy of the house on fire, I tell people you are in the house and the door is locked, the windows are locked, you cannot get out. Now, do you have the right to go tell your fellow residents not to pour fuel on the fire? I think
yes. Absolutely.
Because we are on the same planet, right? We are all living on the same planet.
Absolutely.
The planet is on fire.
Very true. Yeah, and that's something that, I think too, when it comes to climate, I think, I was guilty of this at some point. When I first started out with advocacy, I was like, you can't advocate for anything but ethics. Like, it's only the moral need to go vegan. However, with time, what I've started realizing is that like part of the ethics is defending the planet, right. Because if you're an animal liberationist and you're not protecting the planet, where do you think those animals are going to go? Right. Like there's not going to be a wild to return these animals to, right. A natural habitat for these animals to exist in, if we don't take, the Earth crisis seriously. And I hear far too often a dismissal of environmentalism within the moral and ethics-based portion of animal liberation. And I really want to see that change so that we place a greater emphasis on trying to get animals back into their natural environment rather than, being content with domestication, because domestication to some extent is still very oppressive to animals. Right. All of their decisions are decided by their caretaker, even when they use the bathroom and eat and, shower. And so we really must be protecting the environment in order to actually ever achieve animal liberation. And I haven't seen that as like a really important topic of discussion within the animal liberation movement.
Right. It needs to be, because, the number of animals who get killed every year, there are more wild animals being killed than domestic animals. Because in the ocean, we kill about 1 to 3 trillion animals. Yes. And they were so-called in the wild, right? And we just put a long, big net and grab them all and kill them.
Exactly. And with this, whole change in interaction, in the way that we kind of engage with the world, we have to address things like the way we build, how we transport ourselves, all of these different facets. I was up north recently, and my friend was telling me the story about how she rescued a baby bear. And she said she couldn't call Fish and Game because Fish and Game would have killed them because they're a pest animal. And she's like, do they realize that they put a road through their home? It's not like they put their home on top of our road.
Right.
And, it made me realize that even when animals are quote unquote free, they're still being oppressed by the way we build, by the way we explore our world, by the way we interact with the world around us. We are still directly oppressing them and mandating their deaths, even for living in their natural habitats.
Right. Yeah. In fact, I see in the future, we would not build a road through a forest. We would actually put it on stilts to make sure that we don't change any migratory patterns. So we need to become a caretaker species that has this light footprint on Earth. Yes. And we are basically, our job is to take care of the animals, not the other way around. We're not exploiting them. Yeah.
And like my goal, so a goal I can highlight in this that I think will bring all of this together is, and this is something I actively encourage other communities to look into as well, is there's this building idea that's out called the living building. And it's actually cleaner than any other building style out there. They have mandates. Essentially, it's supposed to mimic a living structure. So the person who created this idea and the standards for it based all of it off of a flower. He said that the flower takes in water, reacts to sunlight, gives back to the ecosystem around, and adds beauty. And he said, these are all things that should be within the way we build. And so there's some great living buildings that have been built. Hawaii actually said that any public schools that are made from this point forward have to be a living building. And so this whole movement I see as like a really great opportunity for us as animal liberation activists. So many of us want to start community centers. And I think this could be a really good way. Community centers are a phenomenal way to teach people, inspire action, and really meet all of the checks that we want in our goals towards achieving animal liberation. And so the idea behind this living building is that you could produce your own food, veganic food inside. The water is all recycled throughout the building, no water leaves. You minimize your energy, and actually in many cases, you produce an excess of energy. So they have one in Seattle, and Seattle's very cloudy, but yet with solars alone, they're able to produce an excess of power that they're then able to give out with their living building. And so bringing this as a community center where we can educate regularly, have classes, have mentorship, I think that's a very important step because it sets a precedence for the way we should be interacting with the world, the way we should be building. And then it also allows for the greater community to come in and out at their leisure to listen to these discussions. We can hold veganic permaculture classes because we need to change the way that we grow as well. We can hold animal care classes and potentially have more room for animals in need of sanctuary. You can host classes on how to be vegan, why to be vegan, and you have this centralized space that can be used at all times to inform the public and host events. And I think that, and again, it stands as an example for how we could be building. And so I think that is a really key and fundamental step in accomplishing lasting change in a community, is almost having like a central point where people can meet at to discuss these problems, because we're not going to get to a point where we acknowledge the problems within the animal liberation movement, the animal rights movement, or any other movement until we can actually have a place to sit down and address them as a group.
Right. So Berkeley has something like that, right? They don't have a living building, but they do have an animal rights center.
Yeah, and I think that's what's helped them grow their community so fast is, they have a central meeting point where everyone can hang out during the day and people can come in and out and talk there. And I think that was a very brilliant strategic step. Except we could take it a step further and really show that it's not just a building, it's not just a structure to meet at. This is about a fundamental change in the way that we interact with building, with the environment, with animals, with each other. And I think that, that's why that can become very important is because it becomes a beacon of hope for what the world
Mhm.
should look like. And I think that will allow people to feel more inspired and empowered to take action because it makes their vision a little bit more tangible. Like this structure is what I want to see worldwide. What's happening inside of this structure is what I want to see worldwide. And by making that goal a little bit more tangible, I feel like it'll allow people to be a lot more empowered.
Right.
So yeah, and then one thing that I do think is really awesome that I start seeing happening is that there is a lot more people who are willing to risk themselves today to put out the burning fire. You know, recently, of course, we've seen lockdowns happening all over the world. Rescues have been happening in mass number. And so I think these are all great things. And I think also with that being said, it's time we analyze. Like, I think a lot of communities really need to take a step back at this point and analyze, what am I doing that's strategic? Is what I'm doing strategic? You know, I actually, I share this because I spent 3 years of doing advocacy and I nearly put myself in the hospital almost every single week. I was so sick. I have medical issues. And so, you know, the way in which I was working myself, I actually broke my days into 2 separate days. So I would wake up at 7 and work until 1, take a nap from 1 till 3. And then at 3, I would wake up and work until 1 in the morning. And so I was putting in all of this work, doing disruptions, protests regularly, community events, trainings. And at the end of this 3 years, I kind of took a step back and I thought, oh my goodness, this like exploitive entity out here, the industry doesn't even know that I exist. Like, and not from an ego place, but from I've put in all this work and we've done so many actions and they're not even really paying attention to us as a threat. You know, it made me realize that I was taking action for 3 years for the sake of taking action and not actually taking action that I believed was beneficial or would directly help the animals. And so what I recently did was I took a step back and I decided to create like a list of questions. I'm going to try to make this into a graphic for activists, but like things that need to be asked prior to any action being done is like, what's the primary objective of this action? A lot of people don't even know what their objective, that they're like one objective that they're seeking from the action is. A lot of people hear an action idea and think it's cool, and so they'll get involved in it, but they can't even answer, you know, what is the objective? And if we don't have an objective, why are we taking the action? Because we're not actually trying to accomplish anything.
Right.
Yeah, who's the targeted audience? You know, the action style should change versus whether you're trying to get advocates to be more empowered, whether you're trying to get vegans to become activists, or whether you're trying to get non-vegans to become vegans or activists. You know, whoever your target audience is, your action should change based off of that information.
Right.
Another one is, how does this action feed my greater vision? So yes, it may be a good action for the long term or the short term, but is it impacting your long-term goal? Is it potentially negatively impacting your long-term goal? So one thing that I can think of is, you know, say you're working a job while doing advocacy. One job that I would like to work in is like, say, the cannabis field. I think that there's so many great medicines that come out of it. However, if I'm working this job and say I'm unhappy there and I quit, is that serving my goal or is it harming it? Now, the reason I would argue harming it is because I feel like in a circumstance like that, especially if you're like tightly networked within it, you can actually be doing things to maybe transfer slaughterhouse workers and farmers away from those jobs and into the cannabis industry. It's a different kind of farming, but it's still farming. And there's a lot of room because the industry is growing very well. So would quitting, even though it may serve my short term of being able to provide more to advocacy, would it actually benefit my long-term goal if my goal is to get even the workers to be outraged at what's happening within the industry? You know, that may actually hurt my long-term goal at that point. Another one is, did I do a cost versus benefit table? What is your action going to cost you in terms of finances, energy, manpower, and all of that versus the benefits that's going to pay off. So if it's going to take 40 advocates, they're all going to get arrested, and it's going to cost $1,000 to do the action, but your only benefit is going to be media attention. Do those actually weigh out, or are you emotionally attached to this action? Mm-hmm. And so I have a whole list of questions like that, but those are things that I think advocates really need to be asking themselves is, is taking action for the sake of taking action the best that I can do? Or can I be taking action in such a way that every time I take action, there's direct results that I can see?
Yeah, but we live in a society that measures too much. I think that because there is a lot of things, there are a lot of changes that happen because of emotions.
Yeah.
Which is very hard for people to measure. I really don't know how I changed. I know that there are a lot of little things that happened in my life. And then I finally reached that end point where I had that sense of guilt and shame that show up, and I changed instantly. So
yeah, and so I think it's when we measure, it's more of just kind of gauging where our effectiveness will lie. Right. So if we look at that could be an objective, is create an emotional stir in the audience that we're going to be speaking to. However, what I think is more what I was leaning more towards when discussing emotions is taking action based off of emotion. So sometimes that can be beneficial, but sometimes if you allow that emotion to sit and then think about your action for a little bit and answer some questions, you can make it a truly impactful action. So one that I can think of is rescues. Rescues are very commonly an emotional reaction. Well, no, I won't say very commonly, that's probably not true, but there are instances where it's an emotional reaction. There are some times where saving that life could be helpful, and there's sometimes where that may actually hurt your overall goal. So an example that I can give to, without giving away too many details, was there was a time I was investigating and I went on with someone, and the goal was going to be to do a mass action there within the coming months. Unfortunately, she had an emotional reaction and ended up taking someone from the facility, thusly tipping that facility off to the fact that there was people on property, and they changed all of their practices. So therefore, a mass action there wouldn't be as impactful. The reason it would have been impactful initially was because there was a mass graveyard. And so we believe that the objective of that action would have been to create an emotional stir in a greater audience. Right. However, by the advocate having an emotional reaction to this young animal, then completely blockaded our efforts from being able to take a more impactful action there that could have actually saved more lives, maybe could have gotten that entity fined or shut down for a small period of time, which all would have been more beneficial acts for the animals. And so that's what I mean when I say action for the sake of action versus strategic action. Is a lot of time action for the sake of action is an emotional response to something, whereas strategic action is, I feel this emotional response, and now let me stop and think about different alternatives, my objectives, how this can be helpful so that I can turn this into the most effective action possible.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Deborah, do we have questions?
Yes, sorry, I was just typing because I think that she just answered one of the questions. So I was just typing about that with the person who was asking. Now there is a question. I'm going to go first to the Zoom chat and then to the Zoom Q&A, and then there's more questions on Facebook. So this, and again, I'm monitoring questions and I don't hear all of the dialogue. So if these have already been answered, let me know and we'll move to the next one. So this one says, Jasmine, in your opinion, are there any forms of activism that are simply not effective and should be put out of use in the animal rights movement?
So I don't think there's any action that may necessarily inherently be ineffective. I think a lot of actions can be made effective. I think right now it's not happening. So one that I can think of that I actually heavily supported for 3 years is disruptions. I think disruptions can be an effective action. However, I think the way that they're currently being utilized is not the most effective way that they could be exercised. I think if we added a little bit more creativity and strategic thought about the targets of disruptions, how we go about doing disruptions, what is said during disruptions, and follow-up actions to disruptions, I think that they could be a lot more powerful than they are right now. Protests are one that I kind of lean towards saying that they're fairly ineffective. However, I would never call them ineffective entirely, because I think protests are great for empowering advocates and communities and showing numbers for the people who support a certain message. So if you can get mass numbers at a protest, what you're showing the world is that all of these people here care about this same issue. And if you care about this one issue, you're not alone. And it's also a very mild form of advocacy for people to kind of get used to advocacy. So I think it's a great stepping stone towards more intensive advocacy with more strategic value. However, I wouldn't say that there's any action right now that I have seen thus far that's inherently harmful. I think that they just need to be improved on a little bit.
Okay, thank you. So you were talking earlier about living buildings. Is there a recommended link for more information on that?
Actually, let me pull it up right now. It's pretty cool. There's an actual web page for it, and then there's the individual's challenge that he put out. Let me see where it is. All right, so I'll put this in the chat here.
Okay, great. And I'll copy it into Facebook.
Yeah, I'll look for some more afterwards because I'm not able to find quickly the other one that I had identified, but there's that one. Oh, okay. Here's a little bit better. There we go.
Okay, so I'm skipping some of these that I believe have been answered.
Okay.
And tell me. Okay, so if veganism is a baby step, then what is the ideal and ultimate step? Can you tell in one word first and then elaborate?
In one word?
And then elaborate.
Okay, perfect. I think, okay, let's think. I would say emancipation is the ultimate step. And I think emancipation for everyone. So I don't think that there's like one big step that we can take. It's like a notion of like going to like a building with multiple stories and being like, what one step do I have to take to get to the top? You can't just take a one big leap and reach the top floor, you have to take a lot of baby steps to get there. So as long as we're not halving those baby steps, we should get there pretty quickly. But I think, step one is stopping this mass genocide and stopping the earth from burning so that we actually have something that we can live in as we're trying to address these other issues. But, stopping the genocide of animals and stopping the earth from burning is our first step. And then following those steps is going to be interactions with each other, the way we interact with the building, the way we interact with technology. So it's just going to be a multi-layered step that we should all be considering right now on ways we can act that will address all of these issues. However, doing so with the acknowledgement that you're not going to find one step to get us to the end goal. It's going to be a ton of tedious work and self-improvement. There's actually this line, though I'm quoting pop culture now, which, I mean, I'm still credible, I promise, but J. Cole says this line where he says, what good is taking over when we know what you're going to do? The only real revolution happens right inside of you. And so what I really like about this goal is it acknowledges that revolution has to happen internally first in the way that we interact with each other, the world, and its inhabitants, before we can start being an example for what those interactions look like externally.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to give one more from Zoom, and then I'm going to go to Facebook. Great. What is your opinion about speaking up about the environment while advocating animal rights? Because in my city, I see a lot of ignorance about understanding the climate emergency. And in fact, I notice resistance to integrate the aspect of environment with the animal rights.
Right. Yeah, I've actually noticed that too as well. And that's why I had brought that up, that I see a distinction, or like a dichotomy, a false dichotomy being made between the environment and the animals. So fun fact for everyone watching, the ALF and the ELF were actually pretty much one and the same organization. The Environmental Liberation Front and the Animal Liberation Front, when they were most active, actually overlapped. And most of their, the members that made up both groups were a part of both ELF and ALF. And the reason for that was because they had the acknowledgement that the earth must be liberated for animals to ever be liberated as well. If we are taking their environments from them, if we're taking their habitats from them, they could never experience a truly liberated life. And so therefore, we must include it in the discussion tactfully. So doing so without minimizing the animal's plight. So not saying like we should focus on the earth instead of the animals, but rather that this is one and the same battle, and that we are trying to change the way we interact fundamentally with everything around us.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go to this question on Facebook. Can you speak about the importance of representation and visibility for people of color in the vegan animal liberation movement? I find it challenging when people pretend it's a white privilege thing and vegans don't care about other issues.
Yeah, so that's a really tough question, because I can kind of understand both sides. So to some extent, when we look at the heroes and the celebrities who are worshipped within our movement, there is a strong presence of men and of Caucasian descent. And so even though there are minorities who are doing equally as important work. And so while I wouldn't say that it's a white movement and folks don't care about, you know, alternative issues, I would say that we do give more representation to men who are not colored within our movement. And that's unfortunate to me, because I've seen a lot of folks who really do good work. And unfortunately, because they don't have the aesthetic of the popular guys out there, they're not getting the attention that they deserve. I think another issue with it, though, less on like the visibility front and more so on the cultural aspect, is there's a lot of promotion of traditionally European, cultural traits that they want to align with this movement. So as a minority who grew up in a low income neighborhood, I was very often taught that being loud, vocal, direct, and confrontational to get rid of an injustice was something that was not only good to happen, but should happen. Contrarily, within this movement, I see in espousing that we are supposed to follow white European culture in the sense that it's not as confrontational. Kindness is the first priority versus results of like getting this change to exist. And there's a lot of tone policing for people who do believe that it's okay to be confrontational and loud and more assertive. And so I think that unintentionally, we have allowed it to be taken over by cultural notions that not everyone agrees with. However, I don't think that it's inherently a white-based movement. And I have met most vegans care about issues outside of that as well. There's very few vegans that I've met who only care about animal rights and nothing else. They may only focus on that, but that's usually because they believe it's the most expansive, worst genocide in history. And so until it ends, they don't feel comfortable giving their attention to other things. However, whenever I talk with these folks, I notice the tendency that they very much care about existing issues. It's just they feel the animal's plight is so pressing. So again, I think that it can exist to an extent, and I think we just need to do a better job at correcting it when it does rear its face, and speaking up about it. And then I don't think it'll be something that's broadcasted so often that this is a white vegan movement or anything like that. I obviously don't feel that way. I've seen many folks of color and minorities who are involved in this and who are active as well. But acknowledging they have their, minorities do have a plight that they face that we don't. So when it comes to actions and stuff, sometimes what we may not recognize is that me, as someone who has lighter skin, I am a lot safer doing strategic disobedience in the current climate of our police system than someone who is a person of color. And we have to be aware of that privilege, that if you have lighter skin, you are usually safer in public. And so that is something that I think we do need to acknowledge and try to create safe spaces within our community for folks of color to be active with us, so that they're not having to face that discrimination alone, and that they know they're protected by a community.
Great, thank you. And the person who asked that question just said thank you also. Now, okay, two more questions that have just come in. And one says, I remember some friends saying that people who go to protest just on the weekend, but people go to protest just on the weekend, but they are not really concerned about the issue. Your comments, thoughts on that? And I think you may have just answered that. I don't know if you want to say any more about that.
Yeah, I think that, again, it just comes down to education. I think that within our communities, one thing we need to enforce and reinforce time and time again is the personhood of animals and, the plights that are going on in the world, and the fact that veganism is a baby step. We need those three notions to be really heavily understood in our communities. And if you notice there are people in your community who don't seem to be well versed on these things, take the time to educate, because again, this isn't about you being popular or the most favorable person. This is about you creating the change that you believe needs to happen. And popularity should probably be the least important priority on that list.
Okay, thank you. And this is a question, what do you think about working with Youth Climate Strike and Extinction Rebellion strategically as a goal? They are highly motivated.
Yeah, so I really like the actions that they're taking. The Youth Climate Strike and Extinction Rebellion are taking really awesome direct actions. I worry though with the fact that they made animal extinction or animal rebellion an entirely separate entity. So what I see within these groups is that they're creating that false dichotomy that exists, which is going to be problematic in our goal to achieve ultimate liberation or emancipation. So I think that it can be strategic to work with them, especially if we can get them to adopt the notion that animals should be covered under this extinction as well. Then I don't see a reason why we shouldn't work with them. I think we should be trying to work with as many organizations as possible, while also not like mandating ourselves involved to an organization. So on that note, what I would say is don't focus so much on organizations as you focus on actions. So I'm not the kind of person who supports organizations. I don't support people. I support their actions. And the reason for that is because people are flawed and organizations are run by people who are flawed. And so therefore, if you're giving blind trust to a person or an organization, you're now losing your own personal empowerment. So I always advocate, like, do actions you believe in, but don't necessarily limit yourself to being involved in one organization.
Awesome. Okay, so I believe that you have answered all of the questions that are here, and yes, a lot of thank yous coming in.
Awesome. Thank you all so
thank
much.
you.
I appreciate it. And if you have any more questions, I want to start doing more videos. So feel free to like send me topics that you guys would want me to talk on. And I would love to. I will admit my mind started out a little bit jumbled because I was really nervous. So I did ramble a bit at the beginning. So thank you all for bearing with me on that.
No, you did great, Jasmine.
Thank y'all.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for it. It was excellent.
Thank you.
It's something that we all learned from, and it's helping us in the movement, to creative. Yeah. Because I have a deadline. I mean, I call it a lifeline that my granddaughter has given me. By 2026, she wants to see a vegan world. So,
is that how that got started?
Yes.
That's amazing. I love that so much.
Yeah. And she sees everything, differently, because I asked her, why do you think the world should be vegan? And why do you think we shouldn't be hurting animals? And she said, when we hurt animals, we hurt ourselves.
Oh, she's beautiful. She's going to grow up to be another great advocate leading us towards great change.
Thank you.
I think the children coming onto the planet today are so wise, and they have it's like they're coming in with a different imprint from what we came in, or I came in with. And, I think that if we can really listen to our children and listen to the things that they're saying, they're giving us the answers. And if we can let go of what our minds are so fixated on and just hear them, listen to them, it's
absolutely
like they're being sent here with messages, and we need to wake up.
Exactly. Yeah. The funny thing is like, I wasn't the first one to go vegan in my family. It was my younger sister, who's 7 years younger than me. So like, this next generation is doing phenomenal work that they don't even realize. But like, yeah, I mean, and she was very stern with me too. She's like, you're taking away my future. You're hurting yourself. I can't continue to sit by as you do this. These kids, they see the problems and they are willing to forge forward for the results, no matter what it takes. And that's so admirable, and definitely something that woke me up, because I was like, in no way, shape, or form did I want to leave mistakes that I made or my predecessors made onto my sister. So when it was my sister taking on the burden and me and the rest of my family were turning a blind eye to it, I was like, no, this should be reversed. Like, she should be living in blissful ignorance, and we should be the ones striving to reverse the change. And, it's these kids who are reversing everyone today. And I cannot wait to see what they accomplish.
Beautiful. I agree. And so there are a couple more questions that are coming in. Are you willing to back up and take a couple more?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Okay. And, I'm just real quick before we leave this topic, one of the things that when I had heard Dr. Rao speak initially, the very first time I heard him speak in person, and when he said Vegan World 2026 and he told the story, and I totally jumped out of my chair and I said, raise my hand. What's the plan? How are we going to do this? What are we going to do? And I was already, jumping on board in the organization. Is like, okay, where can I fit in? How can I help?
Yes.
But one of the things that was in my mind, and this is maybe a little bit more for the woo-woo folks out there, if there are any woo-woo folks listening that tune into the things about astrologically about what's moving on the planet, is that I've been listening to someone who has become a friend of mine, who is very vocal about it's actually, she's in the human design community, and she's been talking about the year 2027 as a time where astrologically the gates of the I Ching, there's a gate of the I Ching that's actually going to be separating, and it will change the dependence of humans on animals, and we will no longer be able to have the relationship with animals astrologically. And she's saying that that's happening in 2027. So when I heard 2026, I was
Whoa.
like, this is the world coming together right here.
Yeah, that's so crazy.
Yeah, really appreciate that a lot, because I do believe that the children are being sent in with a message and saying, okay, you guys who are in a position to do something about it, wake up.
Yes.
And support us, and let's bring it together. So
absolutely,
I appreciate that. Okay, so here's I thought this question had been answered from Miles, and he just posted again. Can we go back and answer it? So thank you for that. It says, what if we could adopt a wild or domestic animal like we do with Save the Children and other NGOs? Some organizations of high trust created this.
This would be needed, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. My eyes are a little blurry here. And then I'm going to read the second part of this too, because I think they're related. A vegan restaurant that adopted animals with every meal sold might be very popular. Adopt an animal and get a photo and history of the animal, or am I commodifying life? What are your thoughts?
I see what you're saying. Yeah. So I think that's actually a really cool option, and actually something I've been trying to push with a lot of our local vegan restaurants is essentially like every single month having like an individual that they're like displaying, and then in the restaurant, and then like donations, like 15% of proceeds or something will go to sponsoring that one individual. And I think that's a brilliant idea, especially to alleviate some burden off of sanctuaries and also off of advocates, because a lot of the times the way it operates is the advocates go out and rescue an individual, then they have to come up with funds to take care of the initial vet treatment and some care for that individual, and then the sanctuary takes them on and takes care of after the initial care, they take care of that animal. And so it's kind of hard though for advocates to do both the rescue and fundraising, especially when if they're trying to stay low key about the fact that they were involved in a rescue. So one answer I thought to this was, there's actually two. Is the first one is just that, going and having local vegan restaurants give a percentage of their profits to sponsoring individuals at the sanctuary. And then the second one is working with local produce farms and trying to get them to donate what they would deem unsellable produce or maybe slightly wilted produce. And we could take those and deliver them to the different sanctuaries in the valley to alleviate more funds. Another thing I thought of is when it comes to wild animals, I don't know how many of these exist, but that story that I was telling you about my friend who rescued the bear, it was a very like low key rescue. She got like what would equate to like a giant like cat trap, and the ones where the doors close behind them. And she got one of those, and there just so happened to be this woman in Texas who owns a ton of land that she bought to turn into a reservation. She just bought it so that the animals there could live freely. And so the bear was allowed to be released there. So if you know of places like that where someone just bought up a ton of land and turned it into like a refuge for animals, that could also be a good place to raise funds for. And talking with your local vegan restaurants could be a good place to start.
Nice. Okay, so there are just a couple of comments. Adopting wild animals would employ biologists at the same time. WWF, has or had an adopt a wild animal program, FYI.
Awesome.
And it says, Jasmine, I do this exactly in Connecticut. This is from Amy. I found a grocer that is in favor of sustainability, etc., and gives me their cut produce scraps to deliver to animals in sanctuaries. So that's awesome.
Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah, we're going to be trying to do that with like the grocery stores and the produce farms around here, with the goal of essentially making it entirely like self-sustaining to where sanctuaries don't have to really ever purchase food.
Nice. Okay. Thank you. So I think now we have covered one that says, I think cemeteries should be converted to animal sanctuaries. That's an interesting concept.
That is pretty interesting. And then I did see the one where it asked, how would I improve disruptions to make them more effective?
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. I just want to address this one really quickly. I think that really looking to one person to come up with these ideas is a flaw that we have. I think that what we need to do is come together in circles and do like brainstorming sessions, like creative brainstorming sessions where we throw out our wildest ideas and then go through that list of questions that I'll be posting soon, of questions to ask before an action, and identify if you can create something very significant from those ideas that were thrown out. So I always suggest a preliminary brainstorming stage where you just throw out all of your ideas and then coming back and reanalyzing your ideas in tandem with looking at those questions to determine, is this something that's going to be effective? So I think one thing, just as a quick example that would make disruptions more effective, is if they were taken directly to the exploiters. So I think that like disruptions could be potentially a lot more effective inside of a slaughterhouse or inside of a farm, not necessarily where the animals are, because you don't want to be yelling, but disruptions don't actually entail yelling in the first place. So you could do a silent disruption inside of a slaughterhouse or inside of a farm. And I think that makes it a little bit more effective because you're actually stopping production at the site of exploitation. Whereas you're inside of a grocery store, you're not really doing anything but creating noise and trying to get that owner of that facility to sit down and have a negotiation with you. And so I think those negotiations could be a lot more powerful if, one, they were taken directly to the exploiter, and two, if there is a greater emphasis on personal accountability for the actions that we're speaking out against.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so just more comments coming in. Start programs in prisons for animal rescues. A comment that Bannon is giving their food scraps to pig farms, and more thank yous.
I would also recommend, based off the notion of start programs in prison for animal rescues, look into your local prison system and see if they're the same as in Phoenix, Arizona. Here, what they've actually started doing is they use the prisoners as slave labor for sites of exploitation. So Hickman's family farms, they were just recently in the news because of the amount of prisoner injuries that have happened on site. When what they do is they take people who are nonviolent offenders, they'll say that they're giving them a livable wage for being in prison to be able to get what they need from the commissary, but then they take fractions of that. And so the prisoners only end up walking away with barely scraping by for their commissary, and they'll make all of the other work details much cheaper so that you won't be able to live sustainably. So they make essentially the animal exploitation jobs the only viable options. And then these folks are now walking out. They're all nonviolent offenders. So that means it could be an advocate, petty drug use, like maybe being caught with some cannabis. And then from that, you're going to be sent to murder animals every single day. And so these folks walk out with PTSD. They are now exposed and numb to violence. And now Phoenix is even trying to take it a step further by putting farms on site of prisons. So there's actually a fish farm that has been put on site of one of the prison industries, and prisoners are forced to work the fish farm for us to have fish inside of the grocery stores. So I would suggest to everyone listening, really look into see how your prison systems relate and how they're interacting with animal exploitation. For reasons that, obviously that's slave labor, and that's an angle within itself that you can take to the media, but also as a notice to yourself that if you get sent to one of these prisons, you may get stuck on one of these details as a vegan advocate. You may get stuck raising fish. You may get stuck having to go work in slaughterhouses. And so just be mindful of this. This is why the prison system, this is why police and why government are not on our sides. They are seeking to defend this asset at any means necessary.
Yeah, and Julie says, a fish farm in Arizona, the world is upside down.
Yeah. Oh, they're trying to make it the they're trying to make Arizona the site of fish farming. Like they're trying to make it like the agriculture here. I know it's the weirdest thing ever.
Right.
All righty. Thank you all so much. If you guys have any more questions, feel free, but
Yeah, thank you so much, Jasmine.
thank you. I appreciate y'all so much. You guys are so wise and have so much to offer. And thank you for allowing this platform for me to talk about these issues that I rant about in my head all the time. All right. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, Jasmine. And thank you everyone who is listening and to this or to the replay. The replay, for those of you listening live, the replay, if you missed any part of it, it'll be up shortly. It'll be available immediately in the Facebook group, the Climate Healers Facebook group, and it will be on the website a little bit later today. For tomorrow, be sure and join us tomorrow at the same time, 9 a.m. US Pacific time. We're going to be talking about education and illumination with Jessica Lenine, Madhavi Kolte, and Julie Wayne. Did I pronounce all those names correctly, Sailesh?
Yes, you did.
Okay. Anything that you want to say about what you're going to be talking about tomorrow?
Yeah, it's going to be about education and illumination and the Climate Healers Groups initiative that Jessica and Madhavi and Jaylee have been working on. And we are going to start with showing why a vegan world 2026 is possible, and it is going to happen. and so then, then we can figure out how we are going to participate in making that happen.
Thank you. I love that because we have to, as you've said before in previous interviews, Sailesh, is that, we have to really get our head around that, yes, this is possible. And here's all the ways and all the reasons why this is possible, so that we can really believe it and then find out, all right, where are we going to plug in and how are we going to help to make that difference? So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.